My name is Dario Hasenstab. I have a degree in international affairs, and I'm here with Balder Hagritz, a former university professor of mine, as well as an IR consultant. And together, we're bursting the Western bubble. Today, we will analyze how to understand the conflict between China and Taiwan through the lens of the Western bubble. Because while Western societies have many strengths and significant weaknesses, in order to analyze these, we use the concept of the Western bubble. But Balder, one more time for all of us, what is the Western bubble?
I'll try my shortest version yet. The West and Europe and North America in particular are being delusional about their place in history and their role towards the rest of the world and their sustainability in a quickly changing international environment.
Every episode of this podcast follows the same structure. In order to analyze each topic, we analyze the following 5 questions. What are the facts, where we provide a factual basis for our analysis? What is the bubble, where we analyze the overarching problem of Western delusion? What is the personal bias, where we see how the leaders, especially Western leaders, are affected by non rational factors? What is the damage, where we look into how and why the Western bubble is harmful? And finally, what is the future, where we lay out how each topic might develop down the line. If you would like to know more about how this podcast started or who we are, make sure to listen to our introduction episode. This being said, let's get to it. First of all, Taiwan is an island roughly 100 miles from the coast southeast of China, with a population of 23 million and the capital of Taipei. Throughout history, Taiwan has been at the forefront of Pacific conflicts, especially between Japan and China. The 20th century civil war in mainland China between nationalist government forces led by Chiang Kai shek and Mao Zedong's Communist Party eventually led to the Kuomintang fleeing to Taiwan, where they ruled until 1987. Initially, Western powers in the United Nations only recognized the Taiwan-based government as legitimately representing the Republic of China until they switched to the People's Republic of China on mainland China. Since then, the status of Taiwan has been ambiguous at the international stage, with very few countries, only 13, fully recognizing it as a sovereign state. However, the United States has continued to guarantee its autonomy from Beijing. And especially in light of this, and the reason why we're talking about this topic overall was Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives in the United States, the third highest ranking official in the United States, about her visit to Taiwan 2 weeks ago, the highest ranking US visit in the past 25 years. Balder, let us know very quickly, why was this such a big deal?
Well, it's a big deal for China, as it is another symbolic step in recognizing Taiwan's independence, which is something that the United States, in a practical sense, has been doing for a long time. But um, this is just a slap in the face, as the Chinese call it, for their claims that Taiwan is an automatic, legitimate part of mainland China and that there is no such thing as foreign dignitaries who can come and visit without Chinese approval.
And so the Chinese response to this was a 5-day military exercise around the island of Taiwan, where it effectively blocked its sea access with, missiles being fired over the island and planes basically crossing this middle line that has been established. Basically, the biggest provocations we have seen up to date. Furthermore, the Chinese government then published a white paper, again, establishing that Taiwan is part of China and that if needed, it will be taken by force. And as a response to this, and as a response to these military exercises, the United States continued to basically show its military presence in the region by sending a few military ships through the Taiwan Strait. And then I think just a few days ago, another delegation of U.S. Government representatives
Well,
visited Taiwan.
they're still here as we're speaking. We're recording this on the 15th of August, and they're still there at the moment. It's clearly the United States um, making a gesture towards China about saying, hey, we haven't forgotten about Taiwan. And you have to see this very much in the light of Ukraine, right? There was a lot of talk, especially early on in the first 1 or 2 weeks of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that China would be looking at this as a test case for if they could do something similar to Taiwan. That kind of analysis was exaggerated. China doesn't have any short-term plans to invade Taiwan, as far as we can tell. And certainly with the problems that Russia is facing in Ukraine, it's becoming a much less attractive option for Beijing as time goes by. But it is the United States basically saying, hey, I know that we are busy with Ukraine and we're worried about Russia, but we haven't forgotten about you, China, and we certainly haven't forgotten about our allies in the Pacific, specifically Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. We're still there and we're going to support them.
And in order to answer the question, why is the United States this far away from its own shores, basically 100, I read out earlier, 100 miles from the coast of mainland China? And in order to answer this, we're already going to the second category, or answering the second question, what is the bubble? Boulder, why is the United States military and Speaker of the House so preoccupied with an island of 23 million people? So, I mean, in that sense, not very significant. But why is the United States so obsessed with this island and so present, yeah, in that area?
Well, so as always, there are two dynamics that create this bubble that leads to the answer to this question. The first is history. History made the United States be interested in the Pacific, right? Remember, and we discussed this in the previous episode. The United States was attacked by Japan first. That's how the United States got into the Second World War in 1941, and that made the United States all of a sudden into a very active, proactive, dominant naval force in the Pacific, with the Seventh Fleet ever since the end of the Second World War stationed in Japan, and also being a protective force for the Taiwan Straits to keep the Chinese out of Taiwan in many ways. It's always leaving an ambiguity about whether they would actually militarily intervene if China invades Taiwan or not. They're not always very clear about that, and on purpose they keep that ambiguity there. History led them to that position where they play this very important strategic role in the Pacific Ocean. At the same time, history has turned the United States into the self-proclaimed victors of the Cold War and the protectors of liberal democracies worldwide. Remember that China is still nominally a communist country, is still a remnant in that way of the Cold War era. From a US perspective, and the US has put itself there at the forefront as the guardians of liberalism. And Taiwan has moved in it. It didn't start out as a liberal democracy, it started out as a very authoritarian regime, but it has turned into a liberal democracy, very Western oriented in many ways, just like South Korea and just like Japan. And so that's sort of the historical path that led to the bubble of the United States being there and believing that it has this role to play. Then there is also just the ideological path. The United States still strongly sees itself as the light on the hill that others have to follow. And by letting China bully Taiwan, they would basically be signaling to the world that they're no longer this police force that is there to defend everyone who wants to be free and democratic and like the United States.
So when it comes to Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan, I mean, this in itself was a highly symbolic visit. There was no important agreement signed. She can't do that anyways. There was no immediate success. There was no real impact of her visiting. So that was highly symbolic, which, I mean, kind of transfers to the situation of Taiwan, where it's really just all about symbols here. Taiwan is, I mean, as I mentioned in the beginning, when it comes to military, it's not necessarily a big military might. It does hold some important position in the world when it comes to the production of computer chips. So there it has some significance to the world there. But this small island of 23 million people is mostly about symbolism. It's about this Western liberal project where Taiwan is part of it, being protected against China and the United States saying that, hey, we are here to protect every single liberal democracy out there.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, Taiwan does have some practical importance, not just its economy. It is a relatively rich country with important production lines, as you said, computer chips, but also a lot of high tech exports that it has. It also has some practical strategic importance because of its placing in the South China Sea. Well, with respect to the sea lanes that are the most fundamental arteries, if you like, of the global economy, right? That go around um, from Japan, South Korea, all the way around towards India, and then towards the Middle East and towards Africa, and eventually Europe. Though there is some practical importance, but it's mostly symbolism. It's mostly the United States saying to those it has designated free liberal democracies, we are here for you, we will defend you, and we will not let you be bullied by evil authoritarian regimes like the one in Beijing. And that is very much still from that mindset of we are the good guys, initially fighting the evil communists of the Cold War, and now fighting the evil authoritarian communists of the 21st century.
And when we then talk about this topic, especially evil communism against Western liberalism and the heroic fight of the United States to protect everyone, is it then also about this wishful thinking, or, and this is something that has come up in the news more and more, especially in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, the listeners know that I'm German by nationality, and then especially the Germans always believed in Wandel durch Handel, in change through trade. Is that at some point, by simply involving China enough in the world economy and by giving them, prosperity and building a strong middle class, that at some point they would turn democratic. Is it also about this ideological, almost philosophical fight? What's the role? What's the role of this wishful thinking that China one day is going to turn into a democracy, just like Taiwan did?
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's very hard to sustain that kind of idea right now. But it's very pervasive still. It's still deeply ingrained in Western policymakers, this idea that they are the vanguard of history, that they're taking the globe into this deterministic direction of freedom and liberalism based on, exactly as you said, the Austrian school thinking, based on the writing from Hayek and Mises and others who argued that once you reach a certain level of economic prosperity with a strong middle class, what that middle class wants to do is protect its assets, protect its wealth from a oppressive regime, from an oppressive authority, and therefore they will push the country to become democratic, to liberalize, to take authority and powers away from the government and put it in the hands of neutral institutions. That is still a very pervasive philosophy in foreign policy making among Western diplomats and strategists and governments. And that's very clearly at work here. And in many ways, you mentioned international trade. This idea that international trade will accelerate this process. It will create a stronger middle class, and then that middle class will push for reform. Was hugely influential in the way that the West treated China in the 1990s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, China was already sort of seen as not as bad as Moscow, right? I mean, Moscow was the real enemy, the Soviet Union was the real enemy. China was also communist, but China and Russia, Beijing and Moscow never really got along. In fact, they had very significant tensions, strategic tensions, despite being communist, both of them. And there was this sense that China doesn't really want to be part of this Soviet game. They don't really want to be communist. So the moment that the Soviet Union fell, there was this idea that all the West had to do was embrace them into their global system of trade, their global prosperity, and China would automatically become one of them, become Western.
See, I very much remember this the sentiment growing up. The first time I encountered it was with the 2008 Summer Olympic Games in Beijing, where there was this feeling of, oh wow, look at China, how much they accomplished in the past few decades. They've created these amazing Olympic Games, big stadiums, welcoming culture, open to the world. Oh, really seems to be working. And then, in contrast, you had the Winter Olympic Games in February of 2022, where it was the complete opposite, where you had strong and intense COVID rules. You had athletes being warned before the games not to use their phones, only to use secure communication, not to speak out against human rights violations. So you have this change, but in these years in between, I very much got the sentiment from everywhere in the news that, oh, you know what? Wait until those 400 million people who are now making this Chinese middle class, wait until they are demanding their rights. They will turn into democracy soon. They will have huge internal struggles. And now, a few years later, we see that there are domestic problems in China, but they are not necessarily leading or pushing towards a systemic change, right?
Absolutely. It's and there are two really interesting conversations to be had here. Maybe in future podcasts, future episodes, we can spend more time on it. But one is whether uh, Hayek, Hayek's and the Austrian school's ideas actually hold any value in terms of China, whether they're globally applicable, because there's some elegance to their thought systems, right? There's some elegance to the ideas that they have, and China is definitely putting them to the test. And it's never necessarily black or white. It's not like, oh, they were completely wrong or they're completely right. But the oversimplified version that Western strategists have in their mind when it comes to this, like obviously that middle class is going to democratize China, that seems unsustainable as a thought process. Now, whether there's some kind of grain of truth still in there, and that could actually lead to changes within China, that is something very interesting to analyze. But it is very unlikely that those changes would lead to a Western liberal democracy in the way that the United States or Paris or London would like. That's one conversation to be had. And the other conversation, that is the real sense of betrayal that exists in the West, that China didn't follow this path, right? There's a real sense of anger, and that how could you? We opened our arms. Generously, we let you trade with us. We made everything possible in the 1990s. We didn't put any pressure on you. You could enter our beautiful global institutions. And how could you then betray us by not becoming like us, right? There's this real resentment about that.
And even worse, how can you use these international institutions against us
No,
now
exactly.
by being the main donor to some of them and very much becoming a global power within the frames that the West has provided and
And not
is now
just,
betraying China.
yeah, and with Xi Jinping actually openly announcing this, that China has a model that is different from the West and that it's their aspiration for the rest of the world to follow the Chinese model. I mean, it's talking about a slap in the face, right? It's China basically sticking up the middle finger to the West and say, well, thank you very much, but we're going to go our own way now.
And so this is the reason, I mean, this is the bubble and why this Taiwan issue is so intense, is because you actually have a competing system, on the world stage. I mean, you mentioned this earlier that Russia does not really offer an alternative. Russia is just really aggressive in its foreign policy, and this is why Russia is a problem for the West. But when it comes to China, you have a real force. I mean, we've mentioned this in the past as well. Is that these 400 million people in the middle class? Well, they didn't come from nowhere. They came in the last. Well, basically, they did come from nowhere because they suddenly emerged in the last 40 years, where 400 million people were elevated out of poverty in a system that is not based on the Western system, but that might prove to be more efficient under different circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. So Russia is a rival in a very simple for to the West in a very simple like traditional strategic sense. Russia wants to be respected on the world stage. Russia wants a bit of territory here and there, and this is me not belittling Ukraine when I say a bit of territory, but what I mean to say is that from a Western perspective, Russia is a threat in the sense of expansion of its sphere of influence and not much more. Um, that is completely different from how China is a rival. China is actually saying all that you thought you were, Western countries, United States, Canada, European countries, everything that you thought you represented, this whole deterministic path of history that you were leading the world into, it's a bit of nonsense. And we are going to show you how to do things differently. And we're going to show the world how to do things differently. And we are going to use our incredible resources to provide a completely different model. So it's an existential threat to the West in many ways, at least to the Western model in that sense. Whereas Russia is not an existential threat. Russia has no interest in conquering um, uh, Madrid or Paris or London, but they don't even have much interest in changing the government systems in Madrid or London or Paris. Whereas China doesn't want to conquer either, but they want to absolutely change the way the world organizes itself.
So consequently, and this is a bit more provocative statement. If Taiwan followed a different political system, if Taiwan wasn't a democracy, would we, based on the argument we've laid out, then the West would not care about China's aggression towards Taiwan. Is this the intuition? I mean, because I'm just trying to see whether we have the intuition right here, where Taiwan is being protected by the West because it stands as like the absolute, basically opposite to the Chinese system. But if Taiwan were to be, let's say, an authoritarian system as well, then the West wouldn't be so interested in protecting it in the end.
Yeah, only in probably, I mean, in the sense of strategically wanting to limit Chinese expansion. There would still be some interest in Taiwan. And if Taiwan says to the United States, please help us, it might have, the United States in that scenario would probably still aid in some way and try to play some kind of role. But it certainly wouldn't be such a big deal as it is now. They would certainly wouldn't send the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan right now. Wouldn't lead to this outrage in Western media about the Chinese having these military exercises and anything like that. Exactly. So there is this real sense, especially by the United States, supported by by European powers, that they have this moral, almost sacred duty to protect liberalism. And if they can't protect Taiwan, then that would just mean that their era of geopolitical dominance is over, right? It would just signify that uh, they can no longer claim to represent this free world in the way that they very much would like to.
And based on this, we have the personal bias, where you have U.S. President Joe Biden and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, who, I mean, they are very long friends and close friends, because there was this talk before Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan that, oh, why is she backstabbing Joe Biden? He has no interest in antagonizing China like this. But Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi are both very much products, and we talked about this in the last episode on the fall of U.S. Foreign policy. They're both very much products of this time where the United States became the world police, and now it needs to continue to be that, at least for them.
Absolutely, and the idea that Biden has no interest in antagonizing China is, of course, ridiculous. It was a surprise to anyone who pays attention, I think, but certainly to my professional circles around me, we were all incredibly surprised by how quickly and how aggressively Biden went after China the moment he became president. It's one thing to still see China as a rival, but the way that straight away he signaled to the rest of the world, China is essentially our enemy. We are going to limit China. China is our big headache, and we will deal with them. In many ways, he stepped up the rhetoric from the Trump era. And he did so out of a real sense of personal, again, resentment, anger. Whereas Trump, we've talked about Trump briefly in the past, Trump doesn't have an ideology. Donald Trump doesn't have a vision of the world.
It was
Biden,
about numbers.
it was about numbers, and if he could deal with China, if it was useful for him, he would deal with China. If it was useful to antagonize China, he would antagonize China. The same with North Korea. Trump was transactional. He just wanted to see what he could get out of something. He didn't have a moral or philosophical framework in mind. Biden, on the other hand, is absolutely this child from the Cold War who believes that the 1990s legitimized the United States in its position in the world. Again, let me remind you, because people should be reminded of this, what a promoter he was of the war in Iraq in 2003. He is someone who deeply, deeply believes in the liberal project. And he believes that China was not just a challenge for the project, but betrayed that project by not fulfilling the promise that they never made, by the way, but that the West thought that they made in the 1990s about becoming one of them. And keep in mind that there's even a sense of anger about the fact that they gave, as they call it, right, because it was a colony, Hong Kong back to China. And look at what China is doing. It well, what do you want? But no, the idea was, well, we give you Hong Kong, but we believe that this is part of a process of you becoming like Hong Kong, not Hong Kong becoming like you. And now that the fact that it turns out that mainland China says to Hong Kong, well, sorry, now that you're part of our territory, it's up to you to learn from us and not the other way around. People like Biden are furious, and it's really personal in that sense. Not so much. I don't know if he has any anti-Chinese, cultural or ethnic bias, but from an ideological perspective, it's personal because he believes that he needs to lead the United States into this 21st century where it takes the world towards freedom.
And Pelosi is, I mean, she's 1 year older than him, so she's the product of the same thinking.
Absolutely the same. And what they have in common, both of them, is that they are part of this real democratic establishment, right? So they're not intellectuals in the sense of questioning the foundations of liberal democracy, or they're not the vanguard of the Democratic Party. They're not the young generation that is trying to re-identify what the United States has to stand for. They're not the Bernie Sanders of this world who try to sort of go back to fundamentals of making American society great. They are Democratic establishment, Democratic Party establishment, and Democratic philosophy establishment. And they believe that they have all the answers, that they don't need to reinvent the wheel anymore. And the only question is, how can they make the world see the superiority of their model? And they're very confused and almost angry about the fact that the rest of the world doesn't seem to catch on, that the rest of the world doesn't say, oh yeah, United States, we all should be like you. They don't understand that because that's how they've grown up for decades, and they seem to be legitimized by that until 9/11. And so now they're in a very confused state of mind.
Is China then showing any signs of taking Western democracy seriously?
Well, the interesting thing is that China is becoming less democratic and in many ways less liberal over the past 10 years or so. And something that was never properly recognized in the West was that even though it had the label of communism, the Chinese political system in the 80s, very consciously so after the death of Chairman Mao, became quite sophisticated in terms of its political rivalries, in terms of factionism. This was all to avoid having another, if you like, dictator like Mao, because the Chinese leadership understood that that had not been productive for the well-being of the nation, and they created a very sophisticated political system based on decentralizing power within the party. You've got the 6 million party members, Communist Party members. It's true that there are no democratic elections, but there was a very dynamic political environment in Beijing, and purposefully so, in the 80s, in the 90s, and in the early 21st century. But now, with Xi Jinping having come to power, China is actually becoming more authoritarian, more centralized with power around him. He's doing this on purpose. There are two different ways of interpreting why he's doing this. He's doing it either because he genuinely believes that he's this great leader that can take China and the world towards a Chinese future, or he believes it's needed in order to deal with domestic problems that China has. And China has some very significant domestic issues, economic, social, political problems, and he felt that the way to deal with that maybe is to centralize power around him. But the fact is that rather than becoming more like the West, China has become less like the West. Even its economic system, which was very liberal on purpose in order to be able to export easily to Western markets, is becoming more controlled, more centralized. So, in many ways, the West is absolutely failing in any goals to make China one of them their own, right? It's sort of, if you have any sense of strategy towards a world where everyone becomes like the West, then that strategy has failed. Very, very clearly so. And I think this a large part of that is that the West has dealt with China in absolutely a unproductive, inefficient, ineffective way, basically making China feel as if it is illegitimate because of its authoritarianism. The West is so in its own bubble about liberalism that it picks and chooses which authoritarian regimes it likes and it doesn't like. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it leaves it alone. But in the case of China, it very much goes after Beijing, say, you are not part of us, you're not part of this world. And what you see then is that China reacts against that, right? It's an anti reaction.
And a symptom of this, or an example of this, is then this Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy. So based on this Chinese movie, where I think this started shortly before COVID. At least that's the first time I heard about it, where suddenly Chinese diplomats had a different way of approaching Western diplomats. But I think you're better able to explain this because you've actually heard about this from Western diplomats themselves.
Yeah, it's essentially a tactic, but one that is very near the heart of how diplomats and strategists in China are now being raised and being educated. It is forgetting um, any sense of humility or modesty that China used to have quite a lot. China in the 20th century used to play a very low key kind of diplomatic game. We yes, we are a big country, but we don't feel that we should be aggressive in any way, shape, or form. We don't have any ambitions outside of our own border. We're taking it easy. Um, and now that's been turned into the opposite. No, we are China, we are a global superpower, and we will aggressively pursue our interest, and not just our interest, we will pursue the fact that we are a great nation with nationalist roots, and that we have a superior system to those around us. And transmitting that through diplomats leads to diplomats at times. I mean, it is a tactic. It's not. It's a tactic based on an ideology that's deeply ingrained in the modern day thinking of Chinese strategists, of saying, we will put you down if we need to put you down. We will fight you if we need to fight you. We will show you the competitive side of the Chinese dragon, if you like. And that is something that is relatively new, and that is very much in line with this idea of China feeling disrespected by the West and reacting against that. Very much using diplomatic violence in order to combat violence, right? And from a Western perspective, because that's what we're mostly interested in, because we're Westerners, it is the consequence of just bad strategy. It wasn't necessary. Wolf warrior diplomacy could have been avoided if the West had dealt with China differently, in a less condescending tone, in a less dismissive tone, less worried about the authoritarian aspect of China. But instead, they created this monster themselves.
And so one of the Western institutions that is, at least in my perception, most dismissive towards Chinese interests is the media. So kind of to this is our third answer to what is the personal bias. Let's look at the media here, and I think it was pretty obvious in the past 3 weeks. Again, we were recording on the 15th of August, so a week and a half or 2 weeks after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, but even leading up to it, because there was this leak of her schedule. So first, then you had this whole bubble, so this whole media bubble, obsessing about, oh, is she going? Is she not? What type of signal is this sending? Then the hours before the visit, people were tracking her flight, and there were live ticker news items everywhere. And oh, is she landing? Is she not? Is she maybe just scaring them? And then when she landed there, every single step of hers was kind of broadcasted. But more importantly, afterwards, you had the Chinese reaction. If you see this from a Chinese perspective, legitimate reaction that, oh, you've just like a foreign dignitary has just stepped foot on our land. Then this reaction was portrayed in an even more aggressive way, despite it not being a super serious escalation as opposed to what they announced before, right?
Yeah, so it is one of those typical examples um, that it's not explicit, but implicitly there is this continuous, very deep bias in the way the media portrays Taiwan, China, and this whole affair. Um, let's take a step back. If you pay attention to all those stories written about the Chinese military exercises, which, by the way, have been happening, right? And it's obviously China saber rattling. It's China saying, "Be careful, United States. Be careful, Taiwan." According to our own perspective, we can move into Taiwan at any time because it's our own territory. It's not a foreign country. It's part of China, and we have the military means to do so. And by the way, they do, because most of their military is focused on the Pacific, on regional strength. Um, and so they absolutely have the military means to invade Taiwan if they wanted to. That's there. But the way that the media has portrayed that, and then if you compare that to the way that Western media portrays the United States military presence basically everywhere around the world, with drone strikes killing people everywhere around the world, um, um, NATO expanding its borders more and more, arguably eventually leading to Putin being triggered into invading Ukraine. Um, it is the lack of balance in reporting is astounding to watch, right? So I'm not denying the threat here that China poses to Taiwan, and Taiwan, as far as opinion polls suggest, do not want to be incorporated by China, and that should be respected. Um, but if you compare China just basically in its own backyard in a very complex situation with Taiwan, doing some military exercises, how that gets portrayed, versus the fact that Western powers have militarization throughout the world, and not just exercises, they actually actively engage militarily throughout the world, is of course completely out of whack. It shows the blindness that we have towards our own actions militarily towards the world, and the love we have for portraying China as this aggressive monster about to eat poor, innocent countries around it.
Yeah, I think. I mean, what struck me the most is I think this was a piece in Foreign Policy that I read 2 days ago that talked about the relative calmness of the Taiwanese population during this military exercise. And the way they explained this, the Taiwanese, saying that this is normal. We've been living under this threat of any Chinese military exercise for decades now. This is nothing new. And at the same time, you have almost a hysteria in Western media about this situation, about these exercises in particular.
Complete hysteria, and it's true. I mean, I don't know. I would have to check the statistics, but I think on a yearly basis, Chinese airplanes violate Taiwanese airspace like 50 times or something. Now, these exercises, on average, these exercises are a bit more than that. These exercises are a bit more aggressive, but it is not something completely out of the norm. And again, this is between China and Taiwan, which is a very difficult, complex situation. And it's not me legitimizing Chinese aggression towards Taiwan. It's just that it is incomparable to the aggressive nature of Western foreign policy. But we're not hysterical about that. The West has invaded countries, the West is bombing places, but we let that be. And instead, we focus on a nation that has shown very little interest in territorial conquest, has shown very little interest in the past in aggressively fighting overseas, and try to portray them as some kind of threat to world peace.
And I think this leads us very well into the fourth category and answering the fourth question: what is the damage? Because you have the media giving this general image of China being the aggressor. Then, as we discussed at length, you have Western policymakers very much believing in the Western bubble. But the question is, and what is the damage of this? Because I mean, so far, at least in hard military escalation, you haven't had anything. But leading up to this, what's the damage of years or decades of this Western ambiguity towards the China Taiwan conflict?
Well, so it takes a little bit, a step like this takes a little bit of ambiguity away, right? It doesn't remove it entirely, but what it does is it's a signal of the United States to China saying, don't you dare get into Taiwan. We take Taiwan seriously and all that. And that removing of ambiguity is probably not even in Taiwan's interest, right? It is in the interest of the United States of escalating this violence, at least this violent rhetoric towards China, and China will respond in kind. So what it does is it's the first bit of damage is an escalation at a time that the West should try to de-escalate. It is the West trying to show that they're still strong and that they will not let China do to Taiwan what Russia did to Ukraine, and that they're still the ones in charge. But in reality, what it does, it motivates China even more to look at Taiwan and to look at its surroundings and say, how can we actually fight this Western oppression, this Western liberalism that has so arrogantly been portrayed as the deterministic path of humanity. It's basically, it leads to more violent rhetoric, more violent diplomacy, more wolf warriors being sent out from Beijing, and it actually will make it less likely that the world looks at the West as a global leader. It's that kind of short-termism rather than looking at a bigger, longer-term picture. If the West really, really would like to continue portray themselves as a beacon to follow, as the light on the hill, they need to look internally at their own societies. They need to make their own society stronger, focus on how to actually become a place that other countries want to emulate, rather than messing around with what China is allowed to do or not in its own backyard.
See, I want to, especially that word, backyard, because this is kind of, at least to me, and this is another provocative statement here. Just imagine that China would say that as soon as the United States makes a move or another move on Cuba, that China would react and China would protect Cuba. And let's say now, I mean, China is, I think they just finished their third aircraft carrier. So just imagine that China would send that aircraft carrier towards the coast of Cuba and basically state, United States, no step further. This is our ideological system. These are our brothers. As soon as you make a move towards Cuba, we're going to protect. I mean, just imagine the outrage. Just imagine the military might that the United States would then, I mean, all 23 aircraft carriers would be pulled together immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned Cuba, because we've had exactly this situation with the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? With the Soviet Union exactly trying to do that. I know that was the Cold War, but that's essentially what Biden has been creating again, right? Washington wants a Cold War with China in many ways, because they seem to believe that rather than dealing with their own internal issues, what they need to do is define themselves, provide a new 21st century US identity by opposing China. And that's so therefore recreating a Cold War in the 21st century is exactly seems to have been the strategy that Biden chose to have at the very beginning of his presidency, and that got mildly interrupted by the invasion of Ukraine.
And this, I mean, we mentioned this earlier, but this is the West horribly overstretching, overreaching, and with this setting this overreach up for failure.
Absolutely. They do not have the capacity to deal with this. They do not have the diplomatic or economic means to impose their will on the world, and they should understand that if they and I say they in the sense of me as well, right? I want to be part of a beautiful Western project. I love to live in a liberal democratic country. I mean, I live in Spain and I love it here, and I would not quickly move to Beijing myself. For one, because I wouldn't be able to record this podcast. Uh, I would love the West to succeed. If they want to succeed, they have to stop fighting other systems. They just have to become stronger and better at what they do internally. They have to solve the very significant problems that their own societies face. And then the rest of the world will look at that and say, hey, you know what? I kind of like that. I would like a piece of that. And that's a long-term process.
See, because we talked about the media earlier, exactly this question or this, I mean, because it's portrayed as the struggle of the systems. So it's the Western system against the Chinese system. But the struggle is not being fought or dealt with on a let's try to be better than this. It's this perspective of we are already better, so now we just need to keep the other system down and convince others that we are better. But how do we convince them? It's through a very much, oh, we are better, just trust us.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It is feeling that it's been proven. There's the superiority has been proven, and those upstarts who sort of deny that need to be put down. And what that leads to, it leads to anti-reactions. It leads to violence. I mean, when I say violence, I don't necessarily mean just violence in terms of fighting and shooting and destruction, physical destruction, but violence in terms of diplomacy, violence in terms of um, economic fights that aren't necessary. It is absolutely in the interest of the West to stop putting China down. Let China be China, you be you, United States be United States, and let's see which one is stronger. Let's see which one is better. That doesn't mean that there are never any strategic concerns that should be addressed. I mean, Taiwan is a strategic concern to a certain extent. More importantly, Japan, South Korea, long-term allies of the United States. It's fine that the United States has some interest there and if necessary, even uses its Seventh Fleet to say to China, please know that there are limits to what you can do. I have no problem with that. But this obsession with putting China down rather than improving itself is what in the end will lead to the West's downfall.
Which moves us to the fifth category and the fifth question: what is the future? And here, and I cannot believe that I am saying this, but is it maybe that the Europeans have so far a bit of a better approach than the United States to this? Because you already mentioned South Korea and Japan, long-term allies. And why are they long-term allies? Because of very strong economic ties, because after the war, also cultural ties, a lot of exchange programs, there's a lot of just cultural exchange happening. And then the European Union has also recently moved into the backyard of the Chinese, but by starting this free trade agreement with Vietnam, where there you have exactly this. So Vietnam is already not a friend of China. And now European Union is pulling Vietnam closer to it through this trade agreement. I mean, whether this is still part of this old Wandel durch Handel, potentially changing Vietnam through trade, is up for discussion and future analysis. But you already have this basically, hey, here we are going to trade with you, and let's not move towards China. Let's move towards Europe. Is that a better approach than this militaristic way of doing it that the United States is currently following?
Yeah, absolutely, way better. And I don't think it's necessarily so. International trade is very useful, even if it doesn't lead to authoritarian regimes becoming liberal or democratic, right? I mean, just the fact that Europe is communicating not just to Vietnam but to China in a very different way, to Asia Pacific in general in a much more open way is much more productive, even if China and other regimes do not change their mind. I mean, Vietnam is still nominally communist as well. Vietnam doesn't have to renounce its communist roots in order to benefit from learning from Europe, and vice versa, Europe learning from Vietnam. And that is a path in which if your political model is indeed superior, then countries that you're openly communicating and working with are gonna look at that and learn from that, and they're going to emulate you at some point in the future. And Europe understands that way better apparently than the United States in the 21st century.
I mean, this is something that I've claimed, I think 2, 3 years ago, during the time of Brexit, is that Europe's biggest influence, at least from my perception of the world, is just through its standards. Is what was it, the data protection regulation, where now we always have to accept cookies, is widely used over the world. I mean, other countries have just adapted to it because Europe set the highest standard, and so let's just follow it. Which, I mean, it just, I mean, that through that way, through that regulation, maybe the European Union has done more for privacy rights in other countries than it could have done in any other way anywhere in the world.
Absolutely, and if you look at the long-term consequences of that, that goes way beyond clicking on a few things on your computer. If you live in Hanoi or wherever you are, it has consequences for your psychological connection to Europe as a diplomat, as a strategist, as a politician. It means that Europe provided a solution to a problem you had in your country, in your nation. And as a result, you're more open next time to listen to them again and talk to them. If you have a government in a nation that tells you that you're illegitimate, that you are wrong in everything that you do because you're not allowed to be authoritarian, and as long as you stay authoritarian, they will fight you on that. That is a surefire way to make them get entrenched in their own position.
And even just on a personal level. I mean, if someone tells me, no, you're wrong, you can't do it this way, how convincing is that? At least as a child, I was never convinced by that.
Absolutely, and no, yeah, absolutely right. And this is something that I actually, if sort of a reverse example here, but it's related to this openness between Europe and China. That I notice is that I've never worked with China as a consultant or as an analyst, and I'm not in any way an expert on China, but we've got at IE University, we've got Chinese students. And a lot of those students get sent here to learn and then to go back and to maybe become diplomats or policy consultants or analysts or anything like that. And I try to tell them, if you continue writing essays in which you're basically saying everything China does is correct and everything that the West does is wrong, then you're going to be really, really bad at your job. You need to be able to learn from Europe and from the United States, just like the United States and Europe need to be able to learn from China. And you need to be open to reality where it's not a fight between superior and inferior models. And you very clearly notice that Chinese model students right now going to Europe come here with a mindset of fighting the Western system. They come here with a mindset of, we are being brought up having learned that some things are absolute truths, and China is on the right side of history and the West is on the wrong side of history, and we are nationalists and we're going to defend that. And that is really, really unproductive if you want to help your own country, in this case China.
Exactly. So it's weakening your own country, and so China has been doing this for estimate of 20 years now, maybe.
Yeah, maybe 10,
and
maybe 10 even, because 20 years ago they were still relatively humble.
So 10 years ago, but I mean, what I'm trying to hint at is that the West has been doing this for 70 years now. I mean, again, we have
Well,
never
or 300,
really given.
yeah.
I mean, I was more looking at the end of the Second World War, but even in the last episode, we weren't able to pinpoint the moment when U.S. foreign policy started falling. But so you're basically further weakening the West, and this is part of what is the future, is that you further weaken the West.
Yeah, you make the West less likely to prevail in this path towards tomorrow, right? Into who the world is gonna follow. From a very strategic, practical perspective, as you mentioned before, the West is horribly overstretched. They cannot commit the resources they would need to have all these fires across the globe. And so, from a Western perspective, what is absolutely needed is to take it a notch down, to leave ambiguity, not to let Taiwan just be overrun by Beijing. and they still have strategic interest, but not to try to escalate and antagonize actors around the world. That is not the way forward for Western diplomacy and policymaking, and I hope that at some point this message will get through to them. At the same time, the future will very much depend on internal politics within China itself, and we can't really judge it. Taiwan is sort of like the stable factor here, right? Taiwan doesn't have much. Taiwan tries to keep things low key. Taiwan just wants to get on with it without having to make hard choices. That makes a lot of sense. But from a Chinese perspective, it will very much depend on the position of Xi Jinping within Beijing. How strong is he? How deep are the domestic problems that China faces? We know that they face problems. We don't know to what extent they actually are an existential threat or not to the current Chinese model. And how will Xi Jinping and other policymakers react at a foreign policy level to that? So typically what you see, if domestically there is trouble on the horizon, then foreign policy making becomes a way to buy time. This is what Moscow tried to do with the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. This has been a common thread throughout human history, that foreign policy making can give you a little bit of space to deal with internal problems at home. And in some ways, this is what Biden tried to do with making China the new Cold War threat. But not being able to deal with problems at home within the United States, they say, okay, we're gonna define ourselves as not China, as the ones who fight China. Now, depending on the internal weakness of China, their foreign policy will become more or less aggressive towards Taiwan and towards their environment.
Well, this seems like a great moment to end today's conversation on the conflict between China and Taiwan. If you have any questions, comments, or regards, make sure to send us an email to jhasenschap@reiagroup.org, and we will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next week when we burst the Western bubble. This is it from my side. Balder, what closing quote did you bring for us today?
I decided to use a very well-known quote from one of the greatest speakers of the 20th century, Dr. Martin Luther King. And I don't mean this quote in terms of pacifism necessarily, but more in terms of the diplomatic and economic violence that we've just discussed in this podcast. In spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence is impractical because it is a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. It is immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It seeks to annihilate rather than convert.